Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Welcome back to me, Phil Craig, and Cocktail Hour at the Australian Bar. All right, it's the Scandal Mongers podcast, really. But cocktails are a theme. I think half the messages last week were cocktail related, so maybe this is the way I should be taking the podcast. Food and drink. Yes. So what's on the bar, you may ask? Well, you may, because if I move my head, you can see there's some gin, there's some bitters, and there's some apricot brandy. Interesting combination. Well, actually, we've been making Singapore slings. Now, I'm sure you all know you need cherry brandy for a Singapore sling. Phil, of course you do. And they're probably better with cherry brandy, but we didn't have any, so we tried apricot. It's quite good. Pineapple juice, gin, flavoured brandy of some kind, a bit of lime juice, grenadine, oh my goodness, triple sec or Cointreau, such a lovely drink. And we were having Singapore slings because we gathered at the bar to talk about our holiday. We're off to Madeira and we're very excited. We've been there 3 years running. This will be the third year. And we go with my mother-in-law, Jennifer, the wonderful Jennifer. A big fan of the Singapore sling is our Jennifer. She'll be 86 when we travel. And it's become an annual ritual, which we all enjoy thoroughly. And it's one of those hotels, if you don't know Madeira, it's favoured by, let me say, Europeans of a certain age in the winter, going for a bit of winter sun. And just by walking into the hotel, Mrs. Craig and I, we lower the average age by about 25 years. So as we said to Jennifer, you might feel at 86 you're, at the higher end of the age range for this hotel, but at least you're ambulant. Because an awful lot of the guests aren't. But it's that kind of place. We go, we relax, we do the same thing, go to the same restaurants, look at the flowers, sit in the garden, read our books, drink Singapore slings in the evening, looking out at the beautiful sunsets. It's always about 20, 22 degrees, like always. Such a lovely place, Madeira. No, this is not sponsored by the Madeira Tourist Board or indeed the makers of Tanqueray Gin. Other gins are available. Cocktails. Yeah, lots of cocktails coming up in the comments. Liz Altieri has to apologise because, oh my God, Phil, she says, how embarrassing. She mentioned the sidecar, which she was, I passed on her lovely comment about how she likes a sidecar. I thought, oh, I'll try one of those. But she had mentioned that it had gin. And she says, no, of course, I'm wrong. It's cognac. Hennessy, of course, not gin. That's a white lady. I don't think I've had one of those. Or maybe a corpse reviver. Goodness me, so many cocktail recipes, so little time. Susan Marg has been drinking cocktails while listening. I went to listen tonight only to discover that I'd already liked this programme. Confused. Turns out I got a bit drunk on White Russians, listened to some old punk rock, fed my possums, then fell asleep to your dulcet tones before you even got to Churchill. That's so funny. I love the idea of people falling asleep to my dulcet tones and feeding their possums. I'm guessing you're in Australia. Or maybe it's New Zealand have possums, do they? I'm not sure. I think in one country you're allowed to shoot them, in one you're not. Maybe we should expand into possum advice as well as cocktail advice. Listening to old punk and feeding your possums, drinking White Russians. Yes, cocktails. Yeah, that all reminded me of that wonderful poem, slightly naughty poem, Dorothy Parker in the 20s and 30s, famous wit. Vanity Fair writer, was it? She said, I like to have a martini. 2 at the very most. 3, I'm under the table. 4, I'm under the host. Okay, Susan, I hope you're laughing at that. BMAC P9S. I love your rants, Phil. Good. I feel a bit self-conscious about the rants, but people do seem to like them, and you can always skip to the main event, which, of course, is today Rory Cellan Jones and his wonderful book, Ruskin Park. We'll get to him in a minute or so. You can skip there if you don't want to love the rants, but BMAC P9S does. In a world, he or she says, in a world where it's becoming increasingly difficult to find a trusted news source, your educated ideas on current affairs are a treat. Oh, I made my day. Thank you so much. Talking of making days, Lynn Reen Enterprises said that listening to this podcast is the highlight of my Sundays. Is that nice? All the way from South Australia. A lot of Australians commenting this week. That's Linda. Yes, it's Linda. Lynn Rient. The highlight of her Sundays. How lovely. And finally, Wildflowers516, otherwise known as Amy, sends greetings from New York. Always an interesting conversation, and shame on anybody who buries sex abuse. Well, indeed, that's a reference to the introductory remarks last week about the Archbishop of Canterbury and how he didn't really do his job and has had to go. People have been emailing. Chelsea Fine sent a lovely long email from Perth, more Australia. But she's pains to point out that she grew up in Liverpool and was a big fan as a child of the royal family. So you want to share this really lovely story, which I will pass on to you. When she was 10, she wrote, she had a friend with better handwriting, write a letter to Buckingham Palace addressed to the Queen to tell the Queen that she was a real fan and she loved anything to do with the royal family and royal history. And she had read books about Queen Victoria and lots of other monarchs. And a few weeks later, knock on the door, letter from the Queen, signed by the Queen, probably drafted by somebody else, but a lovely thought. In fact, Linda says that she thinks it was Lady Susan Hussey. Chelsea. Chelsea says she thinks it was Lady Susan Hussey who wrote the letter. Don't know how she knows that, Chelsea, but nice. And then, the story gets better because then at her school, a parcel arrived full of royal history books from the Queen. Was that a lovely thing to do? I think it also it just explains that those little stories of those little interactions explains why the Queen especially had such a special place, I think, in people's affections here. And I say this as a former Republican, certainly, I'm probably still a Republican actually when it comes to Australia, but I really mellowed experience of working on royal stories and also witnessing what happened here when the Queen died. It's kind of changed my mind quite a lot about royalty and what it can do for a country, for its kind of national morale, and also maybe even for its political stability. Anyway, there you go, Chelsea. You didn't think your nice email would prompt a little conversation about the Constitution, but it has. Other conversations are going on. The ramifications and the recriminations following the Trump election victory are kind of dominating social media. Half of liberals on the left flounced off Twitter. They've gone to their own space, which of course I've gone to because I want to sell my books. But I think Twitter's more fun still. There's just more edge to it. Obviously, a lot more people. Sorry, I've got to call it X now. I think we've all given in. We're calling it X, aren't we? Elon's won. And Blue Sky is all a bit kind of like an echo chamber for people who don't really want to confront the fact that a lot of their ideas have been rather decisively rejected. And that's a big theme. I talked 2 weeks ago about that, how I felt that these culture war issues really did damage the Democrats. They couldn't somehow put themselves on the side of ordinary people and ordinary common sense opinions on some of this stuff. There was a congressman who's in the news. I don't know if you saw Massachusetts, I think, called Seth Moulton. And he made this statement about why he felt the Democrats had lost. And he said, I'm a father of 2 girls, and I don't want to see my girls run over on a playing field by a large, formerly male athlete who has identified himself into their sport. And yet, as a Democrat politician, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that. Well, I'm not afraid anymore. I think a lot of us would agree with that statement. But guess what? His campaign manager immediately resigned in protest. And I think, Democrats, it's the campaign manager that's the problem here, not the congressman. I'm very much, I think, still of the centre left in so many ways, but we need a centre left party that doesn't make voters feel furious that it's woke nonsense. People are kind, especially people, liberals traditionally are kind. They believe in human rights, and in the case of trans people, they want to help them, support them. They don't want to prejudice against them or in any way deprive them of basic human rights. Why would we? But there are natural boundaries. There are boundaries between what some trans people want and expect and what an awful lot of women want to defend. These boundaries need protecting. And, we talked about the rapists in prison in Scotland. It was outrageous that a large part of the left found itself on the side of these utterly opportunistic men who, they were nothing like, they never had any interest in being trans. They just didn't want to go to a male prison. And they were rapists, and yet somehow we were supposed to support that because it was to do with trans rights. No, it was opportunism. Same with sports. It's completely natural for people to be anxious, like Seth Moulton was, about women, both being put at risk and losing the chance to win awards and go to competitions that they trained for because somebody's decided, having gone through male puberty, that they're going to use that natural advantage in a sport where they're competing with people who are, smaller and less fast and less powerful as them, inevitably, because some things are just what they are. And, sensible people like, I'd say, J.K. Rowling, Seth Moulton, they speak out about this. And in recent years, they have been traduced. I mentioned the Guardian newspaper. In Britain, it's been completely kind of fractured by this issue. Many of its best journalists have left or been driven out by it. Hadley Freeman is a fantastic writer, now writes for The Times. She was an absolute stalwart of The Guardian for years. And she was writing about this stuff again. She was reporting this week that one of the Trump adverts, and I'm sure Trump used this opportunistically, I mean, God, Trump is a very, very weird person to hold up as a defender of women's rights when you consider the things he's done and the things he's said. And yet, his campaign was smart. It ran these adverts. Kamala is for they, them. Trump is for you. Yeah, it's crude. It's probably very unfair, but it really worked. Hadley Freeman reported that there was a group that they tested these ads on of committed Democrats who were all intending to vote for her, for Kamala. And 3% of them moved their opinions on the basis of just those adverts. Now, in a tight election, that's a huge change if it's, if it plays out like that across the whole country. And I think it probably did. Hadley Freeman reported that the sentence that these women, these people, men and women in this focus group, the sentence that they all approved was Kamala is too focused on cultural issues like transgender rights rather than helping the middle class. So yeah, that's a problem. Suzanne Moore, another writer, an absolute stalwart of the British left. For years, anybody who read The Guardian for decades, she was an absolutely pioneering feminist, socialist. She was involved in the campaign for women's refuges, abortion rights, and any kind of good cause on the left. She was absolutely extremely eloquent and articulate, and one of the pin-ups stars of The Guardian for a long time. And then she had to leave because she expressed some reservations about some aspects of the trans rights movement, the extreme aspects of it. For example, the Scottish rapist story. For example, what was happening at the Tavistock, the affirmation model for confused, troubled young women who are being kind of pushed, or were being pushed. It's stopped now, and you can find out why that happened in one of our episodes with Hannah Barnes. Anyway, Suzanne Moore spoke about this outrage at the paper, letters signed condemning her. She felt she had to leave. And now she's outside the mainstream, Britain's most important left-wing newspaper. In fact, it always has been, it still is. And she's been writing today about people who lost their careers, their reputations, driven out of universities by mobs in masks, death threats, authors vilified, losing their livelihood. The same things are now mainstream. That are being said by the leaders of the Labour Party, for example, about the Tavistock, about what happened in Scotland. And yeah, so I think this is what I've got it here. Suzanne wrote on a post on X. The fact is, for 10 years, women like me have been campaigning, losing their jobs and being vilified for refusing an extreme transgender. And all this has passed so many people by. And they just dismiss it as a silly right-wing plot or a culture war issue. It's not. It's much more important than that. And she had a real go today at Alistair Campbell this week. Alistair Campbell, he runs that podcast, The Rest is Politics. I mentioned him before. He was also being extremely dismissive of all this. And he said, the changing room stuff, that seems to have made a difference, the changing room stuff. It's not the changing room stuff. It's much, much bigger. And like as Suzanne said, she leapt on it. No, mate, it's not about that. What she said, don't subject me to supercilious mansplaining dressed up as your erudition. Quite right. Well said, Suzanne. A lot of lessons need to be learned. And I'm not sure you learn them by flouncing off to your own little social media space and just covering your ears and saying, no, I'm not listening. You need to listen. We need a good centre-left party again. Let's hope people like Suzanne Moore and Hadley Freeman and, my God, The Guardian should have them both back. Anyway, let's hope that's all pointing in the right direction. Introductory remarks, a.k.a. Phil's rant. Rory. I met Rory, didn't know him, but we have mutual friends. And as I mentioned about a million times, Mrs. Craig is a library manager, and Rory came to Putney Library to talk about a year ago, and he gave such a brilliant talk about this book he'd written, Ruskin Park. He's best known at the moment for a book called a new book and a series of very funny YouTubes he's made about a rescue dog from Romania called Sophie from Romania, and that's really funny. And a lot of people are buying that and talking about it at the moment. But I wanted to talk to him about his book Ruskin Park because it's a book about his life, and it's a Scandal Mongers podcast. The idea of scandal is it's driven so much in his life. I won't give the game away, but he essentially discovered after his mother's death an awful lot about his own life. I should say Rory went on to become a very well-known BBC reporter, technology correspondent, and had a very distinguished career. And he's now retired from that. But he's written this amazing book about how these letters opened up the whole world of his mother and his father in the 50s and 60s, and their somewhat scandalous relationship, and how maybe the fear of scandal and prejudices of that time really set his life on the trajectory that it was on, and his mother's life. Anyway, I'll say no more. I hope you enjoy Rory. I'm sure you will. Thanks for indulging me in my introductory remarks. I'll be back here with more erudition and maybe some more cocktail recipes at the end of Rory, and I'll see you then. Bye. Rory, great to see you again, and welcome to the Scandalmongers, and indeed to the Australian bar.
Very excited to be on the show.
Well, our mutual friend Jane Stevenson, which is, I think, how we know each other, she spent many a happy hour there. In fact, there's a bottle of gin right now in her honour, I think.
I can see it behind you. It's a bit early in the day for me.
Oh, well,
nice cup of tea.
We all know about you writers. Look, it's very nice of you to come on to talk, actually, not about your current book mostly, but about a book you wrote a few years ago. But I should at least start by asking, how's Sophie?
Sophie's sitting just a few yards away, well, in her bed, curled up in her bed. And that in some ways is a great advance because she spent 6 or 7 months mostly sleeping behind the sofa. So she's out and she's a little less shy than she used to be.
Well, most of the neighbours, and my mother-in-law lives around the corner, and all of her friends in a little close. They've all read your book about Sophie. Said, "Oh, try and get her on the podcast." But I'm not sure if she's ready for her close-up yet.
She's not really ready for a close-up. She's got a bit of Greta Garbo about her.
Yes. Well, the reason I wanted to speak to you, I guess, primarily was Ruskin Park, which is an extraordinary book, and it's had a huge amount of success. And I heard you speak very movingly about it the other day in Putney Library. You're probably a bit bored about talking about it, but I'm guessing most of the people listening to this won't know even the most basic details, because we have a lot of American listeners, for example. So I was just going to ask you to start from the beginning, really.
Well, don't ever think that I'm bored in speaking about it. It was a huge passion project, and I love speaking about it. In fact, I do I zoom into book clubs to talk about it. So
how lovely.
About it. So the basic shtick of it is, I suppose, is a book about my mother, and it starts with an extraordinary discovery. When my mother died in the council flat where she brought me up in South London, a posh council flat, but still a council flat. I suppose what the Americans would call a project.
Yes.
When she died in this tiny flat where she'd lived 40 years, including all through my childhood, I went to clear out the flat, and I found under the bed and under the dressing table, which was in the living room, literally thousands of letters and documents. She had kept everything over a period of some 60 years, I think, from the age of 20 till, she died at 81. And the key find in all this was a red box, a stocking box. And on the outside was a message about keeping this for me and for Rory later. And then inside, there
Had she
was
mentioned this to you before? Sorry, did you know that there was something there for you?
no, I didn't. I knew she was a terrible hoarder, and the flat got more and more sort of dusty and so on as she got older. Uh, but when I opened the box, on the top was a brown envelope with a scrawled message for Rory to read and think about in the hope that it will help him to understand how it really was. And underneath
Mhm.
it, uh, there was a hotel bill for 2 nights bed and breakfast at a hotel in Angmering in West Sussex, a seaside hotel, uh, in April 1957. And it was made out to a Mr. J. Cellan Jones, my father. Um, and so that's April 1957, 2 nights bed and breakfast and morning tea and luncheon, actually, for £5 and 11 shillings. Uh, and I was born in January 1958. So, as the Americans will say, do the math. Um, and underneath that hotel bill were a whole series of love letters, and also letters between my mother and friends and relatives describing the affair, which is at the center of the book, and which gave rise to me, an affair with a much younger man in the BBC television drama department in the late 1950s.
At this
Um,
point, I assume you did know that your father and your mother had this affair and that he'd not played a big part in your life, or perhaps you didn't.
no, I did. I did know. I did know. I gradually became aware as I grew up. I grew up without my father, and I assumed that my parents had been married because, after all, I had his name. Um, and also, as I was growing up, he was making his way in the world of television and suddenly became very successful in the late 1960s with being the director of a large part of the Forsyte saga, which was a great hit in the black and white days of BBC television drama. So his face was in the papers. And I eventually met him. I took the initiative when I was 23 and wrote to him. And by the time my mother died, um, uh, I'd known him for 15 years and had a pretty good relationship with him, but one not really based on talking about the past.
Got it.
What this discovery did for me was take me right to the heart of the affair and bring it to life in the most extraordinary, vivid way. But of course, that was 1996, and I didn't start writing about it till getting on for 25 years later, because because my father was alive, for one thing. Other people were alive who might find all this really painful. So it was only after my father died that I began to work out that there was a book in this.
And the book, I mean, this podcast is supposed to be about scandals, or we stretch the definition. But I suppose, in a sense, what's driving Ruskin Park is a scandal, or rather, perhaps a fear of scandal, which is why it's such powerful social history, I think.
Absolutely. So the story involves uh, a woman who I discovered while writing this and reading these letters was much smarter than I ever thought my daft old crazy old mum was. Um, a woman who got married in the late 1930s to a man who didn't like her working for the BBC. She joined the BBC during the war, um, and had a child by this husband. And mainly, I think, because he was so hostile to her working at the BBC, she eventually left him in 1947, which is quite a brave thing to do in those days. And then eventually came to London from Bristol, where they lived, with her young son, and started making a career in the BBC uh, as a secretary, but a secretary with ambitions to climb the greasy pole, as it were. Um, and then in the late 1950s, 10 years after she's separated from her husband, although they've never got divorced, she meets this young man on a production. They're working on a television drama together. And don't forget, in those days, just about all television drama was done live. So it was tremendously exciting and challenging. And she'd had a temporary promotion to something like floor manager. And he was a young man who was starting from the bottom and, in fact, was junior to her. He was assistant floor manager. So she was his boss, basically, on this production. And he didn't, I don't think he realized how much older than him she was. But they began this affair, which was not a fly by night thing. It lasted a year. Um, and she fell pregnant. And it's difficult to imagine these days just how scandalous that was. Um, Rates of illegitimacy were pretty low. They'd risen during the war, but they'd come back down again. 1950s Britain was fairly stifling, and for a middle-aged woman, a middle-class woman, to have an affair, become pregnant by a much younger man, that was pretty scandalous. Perhaps not so much within the BBC, although it was still, frowned upon, but more so from my father's background. My father was the son of a surgeon in Swansea, a very distinguished surgeon who drove a Rolls Royce.
Goodness.
And appears in the letters of Dylan Thomas, by the way. But he and his wife, who had been a sister in the hospital where she met her husband, quite a powerful woman, were horrified that their son had been entrapped by this woman. And there was what plays out in the book and in the letters, there's a huge file of legal letters, is a ferocious court battle just for my mother to get the right to 30 shillings a week maintenance from my father to bring me up.
Goodness. I mean, these letters, do they, for example, include any conversations about whether she wants to keep you? I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to think about. But given how scandalous it was, I mean, it must have crossed her mind that she perhaps didn't want to.
Well, the words abortion and adoption come up. Adoption comes up a lot. All her friends and closest relatives think she should get me adopted. And she's incredibly brave in resisting this because actually, if I think of it dispassionately, that was good advice. Here she was, a woman of 43 when I was born, with a job that didn't pay very well, but where she was just making progress, a job she loved. She had a son, my half brother Stephen, who was 16 and was about to make a career in the theatre and was going to be independent for the first time. And so after years of struggle, things were looking up for her. And my birth would basically close everything down again. A, make things incredibly difficult financially, and B, really make it unlikely that she would advance in terms of career. So you've got to say their advice was sensible, but she resisted completely. As for abortion, there's just a couple of hints about it. There is a letter a few years after I was born between her and her sister, my Aunt Joan, in which they talk of a documentary that's been on the television on ITV about abortion. And what a big business, which of course was illegal. And people faced, severe penalties. And in particular, doctors, that would be the end of their career. And there's a sort of very Delphic reference to, from my aunt to my mother saying, I wonder if what the Catherine Joneses would have thought about this, as if there had been some question of it being raised.
So, is your father involved in this correspondence, or is it more about what we're going to do about this pregnancy and this child?
So, all of my mum's love letters are still there. But that's the last you hear from him firsthand. Um, because at the beginning of when she falls pregnant, she knows she's pregnant in the summer of 1957. He at first is on board. She's still married and needs to divorce, despite the fact they've been separated for 10 years. Her husband's never granted her a divorce. Uh, and he signs a letter saying, I can confirm that I've committed misconduct with Mrs. Sylvia Rich on a number of occasions, and I am the father of the child she expects. Um, and this is to some solicitors trying to arrange a divorce. So he's playing ball so that they can get a divorce and he can marry her and everything will be respectable. But then something happens. He takes fright. He goes off on a course, a parachuting course. He was in a sort of reserve, a territorial army parachute regiment. And he goes off jumping out of planes for a couple of weeks. And then he effectively ghosts her. And all one sees is eventually is a couple of very cold notes. Meet me at so-and-so, JCJ, where it's been your ever-loving Jim up to then. And he turns very cold.
This must have changed the way you thought about him. I mean, you mentioned you already knew him, but only kind of in a sort of distanced way. And now
Yeah,
here he is kind of dumping your mum.
I know. And it's been an interesting journey for me because although I didn't grow up with him, I was very fond of him. And the great thing about my mother, who was a very difficult woman in very many ways, was that she was never at all negative to me about my father. She looked back on it with sort of, great sort of wistfulness and affection. Um, and he was a lovely man, but I think what emerged was that he was weak. He was very much dominated by his parents.
Yeah. And they must
Um,
have thought this is just not respectable. This is just not how
yeah,
things are done.
yeah, and uh, I think it was a shock to him how old my mum was. I think she makes it clear that she glossed over her real age during their relationship. A lady never talks about her age. She writes. She used to say to me actually. Um, so, uh, in fact, I only really began to absorb uh, how weak his behaviour had been when I sat down to write the book. At the time, I first read the letters. I was a young father myself and had a busy job. And I thought, this is interesting, but I'll come back to it one day and put them away. And then when I came back after I died, it was the legal letters that I had never read before, really, that were so compelling, that were
And this is basically her trying to get a little bit of an allowance out of him or his family to
yeah,
support you.
it's a wonderful correspondence because it's with a lawyer called Cecil Parker, who I always find a rather attractive character, a Bristol family lawyer uh, who she'd used when she was splitting up from her husband and having to fight him for custody of her child back in 1947. And she writes to him the very first letter in this thick folder in the summer of 1957. She writes quite a light-hearted letter at first, in which she says, after years of chastity, I've been having what I believe is known as an affair. Um, which is quite a funny thing to write to your family lawyer. And then it gets even better. She says something to the effect of, not to be blasphemous, it's either the Immaculate Conception or the Family Planning Association is talking through its cap. And I,
Oh.
uh, something that, a sentence that one can't imagine writing to one's family solicitor with today, let alone in the late 50s. But she's very frank, and her letters, this is the other thing that kept striking me, are just so well written and so vivid. Such a picture she paints. A lot of the, vast amounts of trivial stuff that she writes to her sisters and they write back, but also incredibly intimate stuff about their personal lives.
You do make the point in the book that the consequence of this affair was, very different for him and for her. And that as you discovered how sort of clever and sharp and feisty and ambitious she was, at that time, the decision to kind of raise you maybe just stopped her professional progress.
Yeah, I mean, she uh, uh, she was in her 40s, so she was, fighting against sort of ageism and sexism as well, as she tried to get promoted. But she had this job, which was a secretarial job. It was a director's assistant, but it was a great job in many ways because you'd move from one sort of mission to another. Each production would probably run 2 or 3 months, all leading up to uh, the night in the studio, where she would sit alongside the director with a stopwatch, keeping everything to time. So it's all quite high pressure. But there was a career path up through production assistant and so on, all the way to producer. And I looked at
Well,
a
as
woman
you
called,
say, it didn't hold him back, did it? He started as a junior,
yeah, he started as
leapfrogs her,
what was called
and
a
ends
call
up as
boy,
a
rather.
top director.
Yeah, yeah. But it was more rare for women to do that. And
Of
there is
course.
a great letter where she describes before she falls pregnant, um, her first production as a sort of floor manager rather than the secretary. And she says, they've given me a great one here. It's got all any number of sets in half an hour, which would usually be in a 2 hour production. And to cap it all, they want an elephant in the studio. And it's a hilarious letter about the challenges of the elephant. But there's also a lot of musing about what it is to be a woman uh, getting a job uh, in what has been a man's world. Although, to be honest, a few years later, that job was almost exclusively done by women. But she sort of muses on whether she should wear slacks, for example, which would be much more practical, but a dress would be much more ladylike and might instill greater respect. And these are the things that she had to think about.
No, it is great social history. And it's also great, it's kind of a love letter to the BBC, your book, I'd say. I mean, you obviously, I'll explain this in the introduction. You dedicated a large part of your life to the BBC, as did both of your parents. And it does come across as being a rather wonderful, slightly mad, eccentric, but very ambitious kind of a place to be.
Yeah, I've always loved the BBC. I mean, I had 40 years there, and it's maddening. It is like some sort of very difficult, very creative, but very but sometimes obnoxious relative. But I perhaps because of my parents, I believe fervently in its mission when I joined it, and I believe in it to this day when it's ever more under siege. Uh, And I just think in terms of creativity and uh, giving all sorts of audiences all sorts of fascinating material alongside the dross, it's just a vital part of British life.
Did she miss it? Did she miss that buzz? Did she
Oh
miss that glamour?
God, yes. There is a tragic letter. Well, it's a rather wonderful letter in some ways. Um, on the occasion of her retirement. She's coming up to 60, and in those days, that meant you retired, no choice about it. And a lovely man called Hugh Eldon, acting as the Director General, writes her a very nice letter. It makes you kind of yearn for those sort of old style managers in a way, thanking her for her service to the BBC and saying she's been at the heart of so many great things. And she writes back to this man who she knows a bit, and it's both quite humorous but also a deeply sad letter because she says she feels like she's being drummed out of the regiment almost. She's having her epaulets removed, and she doesn't want to leave. The
Hmm.
BBC's her life, and this is absolutely true. Although her ambitions have been, curtailed, and she just did um, got on with the job that she had been doing for 20 years, she's still
So you would have been
loved.
about 10 or 12 by the time she retires, I'm guessing.
I was no, I was 16. I was
16, sorry, right.
yeah,
Maths and
yeah,
all.
1974, yeah.
And so were you left to your, I mean, maybe this money was helpful that she managed to get out of his family. Were you left with a childminder? Did you have to kind of cope by yourself from quite a young age?
No, I mean, that had been the case for my brother had it much harder. When she came to London with my half brother Stephen, he was often left in the care of a drunken landlady, but was also very self-sufficient. She was far more careful with me, and she found a childminder who I spent an awful lot of time with. Um, uh, I mean, it was really difficult. She had to, if she wanted to carry on working, she had to have childcare, and she had to pay for that. She could afford, which was this quite rough and ready woman who I called Auntie, who had a whole clutch of kids in a council flat, uh, and I, in some ways, was the posh kid that was probably treated a bit better than the others. But yeah, another important figure in my childhood. But what I did have, which was great, was my mother's family, who mostly came from the Midlands, and I used to go off to Birmingham and stay with them just about every holiday, and really look forward to the holidays to get out of the flat, because I saw our flat as being a bit like prison, really. Somewhere I was certainly embarrassed to take friends. I was embarrassed of my mother, embarrassed of where I lived, um, yearning to escape.
I mean, obviously, you'd had a very different life had they got married, which clearly they were thinking about until his parents got involved. Do you ever feel a little bit bitter about that, or perhaps like your mum, you don't look back with anger at these events?
I don't at all feel bitter about it, and in fact, um, I kind of think it might have been a disaster. I think he I think the age difference would have made it uh, a marriage unlikely to succeed, and
Right.
the different temperaments. Um, uh, and my mother never expected it to last. She in her letters during the affair, she says, "Oh, this won't carry on. He'll find somebody younger." Um, uh, so it's weird when one is growing up, although you eventually realize that you're not like other people. Uh, it is what it is. You don't sit there thinking, certainly as a young child, where's my dad? Um, your mother is the center of your world, uh, which is a bit of a double-edged sword. You worship her. In my experience, you worship her till you're about 10 or 11, and then from then on, she drives you up the wall. And that'd
But
be
how
my
wonderful to be reacquainted with her, though, in the time
yes,
before you existed,
yes,
and to
exactly.
experience the world through her eyes and her words. And, as a vital, exciting, loving person. I mean, I think that's an incredible gift, actually. Has this experience changed in any way the way you feel about the relationships you see around you today?
Not so much today. I mean, it makes it makes one more understanding, I think, of just the sheer complexity of people's lives, and how much is going on beneath the surface. Probably today almost as much as then. Um, I found out about my aunt, who I spent a lot of time with. My older aunt had a very complicated love life, far more complicated than my mum, and which I learn about in the letters because they're so frank to each other. Um, and I mean, the huge change from reading these letters is in my attitude to my mother, because I did find her, and she was deeply annoying. She became, you know, obsessively rooted in the past. Um, things ain't what they used to be. Uh, Other relatives would get bored of her banging on about the BBC, and she'd her focus narrowed. And I mean, one thing was what a clever person she was, which I hadn't really appreciated. We didn't have many books. We had, some James Bonds and some copies of the Reader's Digest, and I went round to the library to broaden my reading. But then I find, letters back from the war where she was the secretary, her first job in the BBC in Bristol, to a man called Geoffrey Grigson, a poet and critic. And he was her university education. She said she'd left school at 14 and working for him and meeting all these poets and artists that trooped through the office just changed her life. And I hadn't really appreciated that.
Oh, wonderful. Well, half hour is nearly up. I don't know whether you wanted to talk a little bit as well about movers and shakers, because I thought I might put a link to that in the bio, because it's such that video that you all did. It's so funny.
Yeah, so Movers and Shakers is a podcast about living with Parkinson's. I've had Parkinson's, or been diagnosed with it, for the last 5 years or so, and I've got together with a motley crew of quite a lot of former BBC people, including Jeremy Paxman and Mark Mardell, a High Court judge, a comedy scriptwriter, and a woman called Julian Lacey Solomar, and we do this podcast in bursts. We record a few and then put them out, and it's been an unlikely hit. We meet in a pub, and you've got the noise of the pub behind, and it's a completely unsuitable location because we're all a bit rickety and we're all sort of jammed into this narrow space. But it's really struck a chord. I'm sort of in charge of the inbox and get the most amazing messages very regularly about how it's made a huge difference to people with Parkinson's, which is quite often a bit of a hidden condition.
Well, that's right. I think if you have it, or if you or a loved one who has it, or if you're just interested, I'd really recommend checking it out. It's also very funny.
Yes, there's a deal of banter. We will always say I start off by saying we're here for a laugh and a moan, and trying to keep the laughing and the moaning in balance, really.
Well, Leo, I don't know if you know Leo McKinstry, the writer, sports writer. He was on the podcast recently. He's got Parkinson's and was, anxious because he doesn't speak as fluently as he once did.
Yeah.
But his writing, he thought in a sense he'd actually got better. Maybe some kind of weird overcompensation or something had happened.
But it is weird. I mean, physically, my writing is very difficult now because typing at certain times of the day, and it's particularly bad at the moment, is painfully slow. And I try voice recognition and so on, but then that takes as much time to correct as to spend typing. So, and I think one worries that one is slowing down mentally as well. So, therefore, that's quite an incentive to get on with stuff while you can.
Absolutely. Well, I assume you're working on the follow-up to Sophie. It's been a big hit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still massively in the process of selling that book because, this all happened in a big hurry. I was still writing Ruskin Park when my agent called me 5 weeks after we got a new dog, this rescue dog, Sophie, and said, I've got 5 major publishers wanting to know whether you're going to write a book. So I hadn't thought of writing a book, and suddenly it was made worth my while to write a book, and
absolutely
wrote that one while finishing the other one. So,
well, more power to your pen, whether it's a pen or a dictation or a type or whatever. And
we'll have to see. Sophie, the video game, maybe next.
Oh, that's a good idea. Well, maybe you and me and Jane can gather at the bar and continue the conversation sometime soon. I'd like that.
That would be great.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. That's been really, really good fun.
All right. See you, Rory. Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye. Aren't I lucky that I get to speak to people like Rory? Really enjoy that conversation. I enjoy all the conversations, as I hope is obvious. And yeah, and that's just a really decent, nice guy. And Ruskin Park is a heartwarming book, but it's also, it makes you feel grateful actually for, I come across sometimes maybe now as a bit of a reactionary going on about all these woke people. But of course, we should all be grateful for the social changes we have seen. The world today, people, especially women, so much better off, I think, in terms of their rights and fairness in society. It can go too far. Of course, we know that, but we also have to accept, I think, that a lot of the social changes in our lifetime have been very much for the good. Anyway, that's what his book made me think. I talked about Madeira. I've missed out the best part of the story, really, where we go on holiday with Jennifer. Me and Francis and Jennifer. We play bridge. Just to complete the picture of these kind of middle-class, elderly English people abroad, we play bridge. Three-handed bridge, which is a game we've sort of invented ourselves. I'm sure lots of people have got their own versions of it. If you know anything about bridge, it's all about bidding and partnerships, which can get heated if you get it wrong. But three-handed bridge, you bid just on your own hand, so you don't know what you'll be playing with if you follow. So we call it the confused system because we often get confused, but we don't take it that seriously. In fact, we enjoy our three-handed bridge so much that occasionally somebody comes along and says, "Oh, I see you playing bridge. Do you need a four?" And we rather grudgingly say, "Oh, all right then." But we'd rather play just the three of us, to be honest. Yeah. Phil's holiday plans involve cocktails, sitting in the garden, playing bridge. And actually, we do a little bit of exercise, and Jennifer not so much. But Francis and I, we like to do these Levada walks, which are absolutely stunning. The old sort of system of aqueducts are called Levadas, and you can walk on them. Madeira is this absolutely spectacular island. It's like a volcanic island, so it's really steep. But some of these walks kind of like are quite flat because they're water, right? So they didn't want to do them like this. So the long walks you can do like around the side of a mountain, following the aqueducts, looking down on the ocean and the towns on the coast, and the vegetation is incredible. Everything grows. I mean, it's just remarkable, like a sort of tropical paradise, really. I don't know what tropic it's in. If it's in the tropics, it probably is. Avocados, you've got bananas, you've got anything you like, just growing there, just so fertile. Yeah, as you can see, I'm excited about my holiday. Maybe I'll do a recording while I'm there. I got a little telling off, actually. JA, that's her username, if I'm quoted, said, and she's quite right, to point out that when I was going on about Lydia Thorpe, that's the woman that disrupted the King's speech in Canberra the other day, that I think I mentioned this already, that I got the wrong end of the stick. I'd said that she was possibly annoyed that the referendum they had on the Indigenous voice that her side had lost, but it's been pointed out to me now quite forcefully that she was actually not in favour of it, Lydia. She's obviously quite an unusual politician, and according to my email from JA, she quit the Greens because they were supporting the Yes campaign, and she was a strong and noisy voice against it. Note, Thorpe is a controversial politician and a very angry person. Yes, clearly. Anyway, I've had my wrists slapped, and I will be more careful in future not to be so sloppy, because it's always easy to make assumptions about people without knowing the full story, and we shouldn't if we can avoid it. Next week, I'm being joined by a guest host, Mock O'Keefe. Some of you might remember Mock was on the show right at the beginning, nearly 2 years ago, talking about Oscar Wilde. He's going to join me, and we're going to talk about Lord Byron, the Gothic imagination. We're going to interview a really interesting writer, Madeline Potter, academic and writer, who has made a great study of that world and that time, and very scandalous times they were. And of course, they also produced some incredibly influential works of literature, Frankenstein being the most famous. And we'll get into all that with Mock and Madeline next week. What else is coming up? Well, Helen Fry is going to come back. So many of you said this in the comments. They loved Helen Fry. You loved Helen Fry, and so did I. And we only really touched on the richness in her book, and indeed her many books. So Helen will be back sometime between now and Christmas. And I've fixed up to do an interview with Paul French, who's written this really interesting book about Wallis Simpson in the 1920s and 30s, and her sort of life before she became a public figure. And very scandalous it was too, allegedly. So that'll be interesting. And lots of other good things bubbling. And no doubt more comments will be made about the state of the world for those who are interested in that kind of thing. So thank you for your company. Please keep commenting. I do try to answer all the comments, or at least acknowledge them. If you're feeling generous, you can buy me a coffee. All the links are in the bio. My subscription drive is slightly stalled. I seem to be just stuck under 10,000, which is annoying. So tell all your friends or your possums or anybody to subscribe. I don't care. Marsupials welcome. Actually, are possums marsupials? I don't know. I should know. Anyway, more possums, more cocktails, and more scandal next week. From me, from Phil, from the Australian Bar, and from the Strawberry Hill Bridge Club. Bye-bye, and thanks. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button, found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.